Associations are another way the NIEM has of linking together related objects. But unlike roles, there is a base association type in NIEM core. Now what this association type provides is basically a start and an end date for the association. So you have two objects and they're associated over a period of time based on those starting and end dates. Then what the NIEM does is it takes that base association type and uses it to derive more specific kinds of associations. For example, an association between two people. And then these more specific associations are where we add references to point to the related objects. So if we make a person-to-person association, then we'll add person references to point to the people who are being associated together. As with roles, associations have information about the association themselves inside the association object itself. So when you look at something like an ownership relationship, for example, and you've got a person, you've got a car, and that person has an ownership relationship with that car, or association with that car, information about that ownership association itself, like when it started, when it ended, information like the price paid for the car, isn't really info about the car, it's about the association whereby this person purchased the car. That kind of information will go into that ownership association. Let's go take a look at some CIFAS examples. The NIEM is rich with associations, and CIFAS is no exception. It also has many associations in it. For CIFAS, obviously since it's children, youth, and family services, family associations are particularly important. So CIFAS has lots of family-oriented associations to allow for a rich and flexible depiction of real-world families. The CIFAS in the NIEM does not try to shove all families into some template as to what a family should look like. Instead, CIFAS provides association-based tools to let you define what a family situation looks like. And that gives it a lot of power and flexibility to reflect real-world issues and concerns. So here we have a diagram that just shows some basic family-type associations. In the middle we have some juvenile, some child, and the child's got a sibling up on the upper right, and has some other unspecified kin on the upper left, has a parent on each side, and each of those parents has a parent of their own, and of course there's probably a whole lot more family associations surrounding this individual, but it's just a quick diagram to show some typical ones. Now, the NIEM doesn't really call it exactly parent and sibling. The NIEM's got its own way of referring to them, and it really does have via two main associations. Let's take a look at them. Here's the same diagram, only the various relationships have been replaced with the NIEM words for those. So we'll see now that parents become parent-child associations, and it's a very self-explanatory name. It's an association linking a parent to his or her child. So we'll see that those grandparents at the bottom have a parent-child association with the mother and father, and they have a parent-child association with the kid in the middle. Meanwhile, we see that we have that sibling relationship is called person-other-kin. And that's the second main way that the NIEM does family associations via the CIFAS domain. And it sounds like it's not very powerful, right? It's just person-other-kin, except for remember that associations can have information specific to the association itself inside of it, just like roles did. Now, if you think way back to when we were first talking about code tables and code lists in the NIEM and how those show up in XML, the example I used was something called person-other-kin association category code. Oh my long. Okay, so, and it's that code that is used to qualify what kind of other-kin relationship this is. Now, two important things. Number one, okay, there's a code table of a bunch of different options for describing just exactly what sort of kinship association we have here. One of them, of course, is brother. There's also sister, but there's also a great number of other ones. If you didn't want to link grandparents via the parent via two parent-child associations, well, yes, grandfather and grandmother are both in there, both in maternal and paternal forms. There are other ones in there as well. You want godfather or godmother? They're in there. If you need niece, you need nephew, that's in the code table. Aunts and uncles, they're in the code table. Sister and brother-in-laws, they're in the code table as well. Domestic partner, they're in there. Fiance, that's in there. Even fictive kin for, you know, Uncle Joe that really isn't technically an uncle but a close family friend. Those are all in there in that code table. But also remember that all the code tables in the NIEM and in CIFAS as well also have textual counterparts, so that if what you need isn't in the code table, that's still okay because you can use the plain text string version of person, other, kin, association category, this time called text, that has a plain text field. And you can put whatever text you need to put to describe a particular relationship. So the combination of these two, the parent-child, which is just such a basic association that it has its own term for it, but then this very flexible other kin allows you to really build any kind of family situation you might have and be able to represent that in an information exchange using the NIEM and pieces from the CIFAS domain. So how technically does the NIEM set these associations up? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it starts with an association-based type called association type. And that is just basically your basic empty association. It doesn't actually associate anything together. It acts as a base for later associations. Now, the only thing the association type adds is the association begin date and the association end date, because all associations have beginning and end dates. And so this is a common thing for the base to have that then gets inherited by more specialized versions of associations. From that base association type, we make more specialized versions of associations. In this case, in the CIFAS domain, we use it as a base for a parent-child association. So here's the schema that defines that. We have parent-child association type, and it's based on the NIEM course association type. So it inherits that beginning and ending date. To that, we add some references. Reference 1 is that child reference, and that actually points to the person object that is the child in this association. The second one is the person-parent reference, and that would point to the parent, the person who is the parent in this association. So now we have an association with a starting and an end date and two references, one to point to the child and one to point to the parent. There's also some information about the association itself also inside that element, and so we can see the rest of it listed here. The one I want to really point out, though, is the parent-child kinship category. This is a means for more fully specifying the nature of the parent-child relationship. So this code table contains things like adoption, biological, foster, marriage, putative, and surrogate. And then it also has, of course, as all code tables do, a textual-based one as well, so that if you have some other information that more accurately describes this particular parent-child relationship, you can add it here. So that's what it's there for. Again, it gives a lot of flexibility to allow you to accurately reflect real-world family relationships. The person-other kin association looks very similar. Again, it starts by being based on association type, so it gets the starting and end dates. To that, it adds two references to point to the two people that are part of this particular association. One being the source reference and the other being the target reference. Again, we note that it has this person-other kin association category, which is a code table and a text string, allowing you to specify with an awful lot of detail exactly what kind of association this is. What kind of family relationship are we representing with any particular use of the person-other kin association? So how do these associations look in an instance document? Well, something like this. At the top we see we have three person objects, and right now the first one's the parent, the second one's the child, and the third is the sister, and this goes back to that earlier diagram. And we just give them IDs. Again, these are just internally unique IDs, so the parent's got ID 0001, and the child, who is in the center of the diagram, had ID 0002, and the sister is ID 0003. And then after that, we have two associations that link all these together. So the first is that parent-child association. It has a child reference with an ID 0002 that points up to that person object representing the child. And then there's a second reference, the person-parent reference, with an ID of ID 0001, which points all the way up to that person object that's representing the parent. Following that, we have another association, that's the person-other kin association, and it has a person source reference, so basically the object, the person who is being related to somebody else, so that points to 0003, that's the third person, that's the sister. So the sister is the source, and then there is the person target reference, which points to ID 0002, and that's the child in the center of the diagram we've been talking about. And then there is the person other kin association category code, and this time it has a value of sister. And so what this whole association says is that the thing pointed to by the source reference is the sister of the thing pointed to by the target reference. So that's what that whole association says. And basically what it says is that person with the ID 0003 is the sister of the person object with the ID 0002. So let's do an exercise using association so you can get a little bit of experience with it. And now this one gets to be a little bit complex. I mean, it's not really that complex, it's just there's a lot of pieces to think about. The idea here is we're going to show you some snippets of schema on the next two slides. One is going to be a set from CIFAS and the other is going to be a set from NIEM Core. Combining those with the person object and the CIFAS student role that we've seen before, and we've seen the student role just a few slides back right before we started talking about associations. So at the end of our discussion on roles, we were dealing with a student role. So taking that student role and the person object we've been using all along, we want to create an instance document linking the person and their role as a student to a school. And we're going to get the pieces for doing that linking on the next two slides. One of the things you'll see in the exercise is a school resource officer. And for the purposes of this exercise, you can just leave that as an empty singleton tag. In other words, you've got the angle bracket, CIFAS : school resource officer, / and the closing angle bracket. If you're really ambitious, you can certainly look up what goes inside of a school resource officer, which is of enforcement official type. Go find that out and put more information into the exercise, but you really don't have to. You just leave that as an empty singleton tag. So let's take a look at those schemas. This first schema snippet is from CIFAS. In it we have the school student association type being defined. Now its base is person organization association type, which is in turn derived from that generic association type. Now you can probably guess what's in a person organization association type. That would be a reference to a person and a reference to an organization. And that's what we'll see in the next schema snippet. What we add to that is a school student ID. Now, of course, there's actually more inside of a school student association than just a school student ID, but we wanted to keep it all on one slide, so there you go. After that, we have school type. And again, this is out of the CIFAS domain, and school type just extends organization type. One of the things it adds is a school resource officer. And then at the bottom, we have three elements being defined. A school element of school type, so it's just an organization with that school resource officer added. The school resource officer itself of enforcement official type, but again, in your solution, just make that an empty singleton tag. We don't need to look up the details of it now. And then finally, the school student association element of the association type that we just defined. So the only thing missing is, what is this based out of NIEM? Let's look at that. Here's the section out of the NIEM. Here is person organization association type. Again, you'll see that it's extended from that generic association type, giving it a starting and end date, and it adds a person reference and an organization reference, exactly what you would expect, allowing you to link a person and an organization together in an association. Now, I also added the element declaration. There is a generic person organization association for just linking generically a person and an organization, but you wouldn't use that a whole lot. Rather, you would use this type as a base for a more specific type, as we did in the previous slide. So now, using everything that you've seen so far, the person object, the student role, and the school student association, show us in an instance document how you would link all of this together. So here's our solution, and as you can see, we're starting to get a lot of stuff here. At the top we have the person object, that's our person, and they have that ID of ID 0001, again, not meaningful outside of the context of this document, it's just an internal unique ID, and they've got eye color and they've got a name. And then we have the student role from our examples before, and the student role has a role of person reference that points to the person playing the role, so it has that ref equals ID 0001, and so that points up to the person. Now what we've added here is a school object, and we've given it an ID of ID 0004. Why not ID 0002? Well, we've used that before, and in case I want to mix all this together with those other person objects, I don't want the IDs to collide. They have to be unique. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be ID 0004. It could be Fred. Really, it could. It just needs to be a unique string, unique within this XML document. But we used ID 0004. Inside of it, it has a school resource officer, which we just did as an empty singleton tag. And in the real world, we'd have even more stuff in there. We'd have an organization name and other things. And then finally, at the bottom, we have the school student association. And that does some linking as well. It starts with a person reference with the ref equals ID 0001. So it points all the way up to that person object. So the person part of this association is our person up at the top. And then we have an organization reference with an ID 0004, which points to the school we just created. And what that does then is link that person with that school as a student-school association. Finally, we have the school student ID. And what's interesting there is you have to remember that the school student ID is not really a piece of information about the student, his or herself. It's really about that student's enrollment at a particular school. So it really is part of the association and not part of the student role. And so that's the school student ID. And all of that links all that together. Now, one thing you might notice at this point, and it is a little confusing with our naming, is if it's school student association, why am I linking it to the person and not to the student role? And the answer is you could link it to the student role if you wanted to. I don't know that it violates any rules, but it is a person reference inside, and person references normally point to person objects, not to roles the object plays. Now, does it make a difference? Maybe. Maybe you can tease out a difference there where one is really a lot better than the other. In general, I'd stick with pointing person references at person objects and not at roles that they may play. But that said, I don't know of anything horribly wrong with giving that student role an ID of its own and pointing the reference at the student instead.